September is a month in which we commemorate the life of Steven Bantu Biko, who is widely recognized as a father of the Black consciousness movement. Biko was brutally murdered by the apartheid government on the 12th of September 1977. At a time when Black people needed a voice to reassert their identity, Steve Biko's Black consciousness movement became a rallying call to self-affirmation. Good evening, welcome to Unfiltered. I'm your host, Sizwe Mpofu Walsh. Tonight we ask, has democratic South Africa failed Biko's legacy? And joining us for this conversation, I'm extremely glad to welcome Black consciousness movement activist and friend to the late Steve Biko, Professor Sats Cooper. And also joining us on Zoom, we invite a former commissioner of the TRC, Mary Burton. Remember to comment on X using our handle @Unfiltered SABC. Before we embark on our conversation, let's take a look at this scene setter.
Wake up and do something now, not tomorrow.
Today, many believe the Black consciousness movement has become even more relevant in post-apartheid South Africa in order to address various social challenges facing Black people, including racism and continued economic exclusion. The Black consciousness movement in South Africa was defined by Biko as the awakening of self-worth in the Black nation, a positive and unifying identity for Black Africans. This philosophy sought to rightfully entrench pride in a society that was then regarded as inferior. Both the Black consciousness movement and the South African student organization SASO became a driving force which ignited the 1976 Soweto uprisings. That year, on the 16th of June, thousands of students took to the streets of Soweto in protest against the use of Afrikaans as the language of teaching in Black schools. Today, movements such as Black Lives Matter as well as Fees Must Fall have become a rallying call for inclusivity. But 30 years since the fall of apartheid, inequality, poverty and unemployment have become fodder for daily news. Failing infrastructure and inner city decay, hopelessness and homelessness have become a symbol of what South Africans fought so hard against. Back then, Steve Biko believed and argued that liberation was possible only when Black people were themselves agents of change. But despite the many strides the country has made towards improving the lives of the mostly Black, poor and marginalized, statistics have shown that South Africa is a country facing social decline. With the widening wealth gap and shrinking tax base, more and more South Africans are now dependent on social grants, draining state coffers of billions of rands per year. State funds have been lost through corruption and wasteful expenditure, leaving too little to spend on improving lives. Kinosi Kwene, Unfiltered, on the SABC News Channel 404.
Welcome back to Unfiltered. Tonight we're asking whether democratic South Africa has lived up to or tarnished the important legacy of Steve Bantu Biko. Professor Cooper, thank you so much for joining us, and who better to speak to us tonight, someone with a pulse on South Africa's present but also a history in Black consciousness. Of course, there are many political questions we could ask tonight, but firstly, I just want to ask whether any personal memories of your interaction with Steve Biko stand out from this particular vantage point in South Africa's history that you can share with us?
Yes, I must first say that the SABC is a phenomenal repository of footage and archival material, which unfortunately lies hidden and should be made much more available because a lot of it was part of the past and probably many of us need to utilize that to make some of the things that happened in the past fresh for people like yourself, you know, in their early mid-30s and younger, who have no recollection really of that past. And so for the majority of your viewers now, that is so as well. Steve, I think, is best reflected in his own words, but I'm not going to quote him at all. The memories that come to mind are amongst them are my first engagement with him when I was a 17-year-old at University College, going on to 18, and he was at medical school. I was at an ethnic university college that eventually became the University of Durban Westville, which I opposed, and ironically I ended up being its vice chancellor 20 years ago. But from there, this relationship developed as it developed with key figures, Bani Pichana and others who were founding fathers of black consciousness. Bani is alive and well, and participating still in our public life. The abiding memory for me, really, is when he testified as our chief defense witness in the trial that became known as the SASO-BPC trial, the trial of S. Cooper and 8 others, where we were accused of various acts of treason in terms of the Terrorism Act. The minimum sentence was 5 years if you were convicted, and Steve was intended to be our first defense witness. As it turned out, Steve decided to drive from his hometown, where he was restricted, and stopped in every village and town. So he pitched at the case about 2 weeks later, by which time, I mean, the case had to move on.
Yeah.
So Rick Turner was the other witness we had brought, and Rick Turner was going to testify as a white person about black consciousness, that there was no, the black consciousness was indeed deliberately misunderstood by the media at that time to be anti-white. And so Rick Turner enters the witness box. When he finishes, there's still no Steve, and a few other witnesses, including Bishop Manas Buthelezi, enter the witness box. They dispensed with, and eventually one of us has to testify, and I'm accused number 1, so I have to testify, and I testify. And here rocks Steve, plumb in the middle of my evidence in chief. I was in the witness box for about for over a period of 3 weeks, and then Steve entered. Mine was to refute the allegations against us, and Steve's was to talk about black consciousness, its impact, and his writings, which are captured in Frank Talk, I Write What I Like, which he wrote in his early 20s. Because by the time he was banned, I was 22 when we were banned, he was 25, and his writing had to stop. So that powerful impact contributed a lot to the raising of consciousness. There was no television, but the media covered it, both the English language media as well as the Afrikaans media. And so that played a key role in spurting the young people who were involved in the June 16th uprising. And during that trial, and after his testimony, after his cross-examination, and he was about to leave, he realized my traipsing to Pretoria every now and then as our defense witness would end. But he also knew we were going to get convicted, and we knew we were going to get convicted. But the mission was to actually unite the liberation movement, because we could not continue with different parts of the liberation movement in the forms they were in. And history shows that we ought to have united earlier. We did not unite, and we have not united. And his mission was curtailed when he was arrested, because he had done what he needed to do internally. And in late August, he was going to be flown out to meet with O.R. Tambo. All of that ended with the brutal murder of Bantu Steven Biko.
Indeed, fascinating historical anecdotes from a period of our history that in so many ways people in my generation look to only as myth now. Mary Burton, thank you very much for joining us. It's wonderful to have you here as well. In your recent book, you spoke about that moment of political history in the 1970s, of course, where you were also extremely active. What are your personal memories of the importance of Steve Biko at that particular time in our country's life?
I believe that Steve Biko began to have an impact on all South Africans, but significantly white ones, in the years when he was active in student politics. And he aroused so many young people to understand the full implications of what apartheid was doing to their own lives, and brought them into a broader movement, understanding exactly where the argument in favor of black consciousness and black awareness had to lead to the breakaway from the student movement. But it was not a breakaway that was a hostile act. It was an attempt to build a strong identity. And that resonated with us very much as we watched the process of the work that Steve Biko was doing. So when he was arrested and then killed, it was an enormous, enormous shock. It was such a feeling of disaster impending, and so many small bridges that were being built being destroyed. His leadership must have left a great vacuum among millions of young black people, and it certainly did in South Africa as a whole. So for me, relatively young and new in the South African extra-parliamentary political movements, it was really a time of great growth in understanding and greater renewed commitment to bringing about change in a united way among the opposition to apartheid.
Could I ask you, having reflected on your personal experiences, what do you think of the way that we publicly commemorate Steve Biko today, and whether you think we're doing an effective or an ineffective job in our acts of public commemoration?
These acts are enormously important because young people nowadays seem not to know any of their own history, except in small instances and usually in fairly privileged schools where history is given a deeper time and attention than it is in so many underprivileged schools. Young people just don't understand what the struggles of that time were like, and these huge strides forward that were being made in building the blocks that should have brought us to a change in society much earlier. They are angry now, the young generation, and one can't blame them, but it would be helpful for them to understand. So I think that the work that you do in commemorating is very important, but it's very difficult because there is only so much time given in the media. It requires all of us, organizations and individuals and faith movements, as well as the political role of political identities, to remember and to build on the past.
Professor Cooper, what are your thoughts on the way we publicly commemorate Steve Biko? Do you think that we're doing it right, or do you think that there's more that could be done? Do we over-deify Biko? What are your thoughts on our current public commemoration?
Look, I'll deal with the last part first. Martyrs become martyrs because they usually die young. When they they reach a ripe old Methuselah age, you can see all the flaws in them. That being said, we have a panoply of striking leadership across the board in this country, and most of them will be terribly upset and shocked at how we have degraded ourselves under democracy, with the kinds of things that have become almost daily complaints. In Afrikaans, in prison, they would come and say, het jy klagtes en versoeke, complaints and requests and complaints. And we've become a whining and whinging society because we've been let down by leadership. Whoever is in leadership now actually has let us down phenomenally. And let's even leave Biko aside. I'll be kind, if 1/3 of the Freedom Charter were implemented, I'll take a vow of silence and not say a word ever again. And if we can achieve it by our 30th anniversary next year, I will definitely do, and you can call me out. I'm saying it live on air. You can call me out on it. That's how bad we have become self-serving. Leadership is not about yourself. One ought not to be the agenda. The agenda ought to be those in whose name you are purporting to act. And we don't do that. So we don't celebrate the lives of Biko. We don't celebrate the lives of Sobukwe. We don't celebrate the lives of Tambos, the Hanis of our liberation pantheon. Madiba, yes, gets trotted out every now and then, often really suspiciously and opportunistically, but outside of that, we don't. So we're a very ungrateful people because we don't recognize those who gave their all. And in the case of Biko, in the case of Hani, in the case of Sobukwe, died, were killed in brutal ways.
Indeed. Let's park it there. We're going to go to a break. We're asking to what extent democratic South Africa has failed to live up to the legacy of Steven Bantu Biko. And when we come back, we'll explore this question in further depth with our guests, Professor Sats Cooper and Mrs. Mary Burton. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're discussing the legacy of Steve Biko as in September we commemorate his life and reflect on what it means not just for South Africa's past, but its present and indeed its future. Mrs. Burton, thank you for joining us once again. And there's something interesting that I'd like to touch on now, which is the role that Steve Biko plays in South Africa's national psychology. Whenever you bring up Biko, to many people you can see a wince, you can see a deep scar that still lingers in many people and indeed in our nation's very consciousness. How do you reflect on the role that Steve Biko plays in South Africa's consciousness today and the prominence that he continues to have at this point?
I think Steve Biko's name continues to be remembered, both because of his life and the work and his writing, which remains available. So we need to pursue that. But it also is because of the lack of people who stand up in comparison to his leadership. Where are the people today who are articulating those views, who are criticizing our society, who are leading students and other activists to campaign not for their own particular needs, but for the country as a whole, and to demand of the government that we are electing to respond to the needs of the majority of the population, who continue to be excluded, who continue to be victimized still in many ways, that are not exactly the same, but the kind of things that Biko was talking about. And so we need to remember not only him, the man, but the issues that he was raising and the fact that they are still relevant today.
Indeed, intergenerational trauma is something that you, Professor Cooper, have spoken a lot about in terms of the South African experience and that feeling of trauma that gets passed on from one generation to another. Biko seems to play quite a central role in the way that we experience that national trauma. How do you reflect on his particular role in our national consciousness?
Well, look, I ended up doing psychology, largely influenced by Biko. And looking at ourselves and the deliberate divisions that were legally created because there was something wrong with that picture. We all have the same biology, except for reproductory differences. We all have the same ingredients, larger or lesser melanin, that in this country at least, maybe texture of hair, has distinguished the hierarchy of power. There's still the aspiration to be something else than oneself. That causes untold trauma, but beyond, and that's at a fairly superficial, skin-deep level. But seriously, over the period of colonization, the impact of the past laws. This year is the 100th anniversary of the creation of the first African township, Kwalanga, named after Langa Libelele, who was imprisoned on Robben Island of the Amahlubi. We have not taken account of the massive dislocation, psychic, physical, and the physical ones we still have, because our spatial arrangements still remain that of the past, where people have been consigned to certain places and you're not seen. When democracy, with the advent of democracy, then people rush into these areas that previously some of us regarded as ours, but you're still not wanted. You're looked at suspiciously. The trauma of the past laws is so massive. And speak to anybody who dreaded the Section 9, where you could just be farmed out to a farmer for 10 years or something like that. The person who came home after work and the curfew prevented him remaining in the city, he was now a man in the house. But essentially, he was inferiorized in the workplace. Jobs, I was privileged in that the people who taught me could not become the nuclear physicists, could not become the talk show hosts, could not do most of those things that were precluded. And so we actually had probably the best education, including under democracy. And constantly, our children are confronted with some stupid teacher or rule in a school which says, your hair, and so on. The diminishing, and then the defense of that. So we don't have merely the trauma that comes from those who brought in democracy, but multi-generational impacts. Anywhere else we'd be studying this and looking at our healthcare system and particularly our psychological health and looking to overcome it, but we haven't. What we did at the Rendezvous of Victory in '94 is we did a 180-degree turn from a totalitarian system of yore to one that of a laissez-faire democracy, and the result is we did not have a transition. In many ways, some of you younger writers may think that we actually are in transition now with a kind of anger, etc. And then we blame them, you see, and we don't understand why that is there. We have a massive amount of work to do, and nobody is bothering about looking at the causes. Money gets pumped into the effects. Now we need treatment at that level, but we need to remove it from essentially two places: our healthcare system and our education system, both of which have deteriorated phenomenally. And that education system continues to inferiorize the majority of our children, both black and white, in interminable ways. You know?
Let me put those interesting provocations to Mrs. Burton, because there's also something which I hear from Professor Cooper as well about the role of death in detention and that plays and that has continued to play in South African history. And of course, Biko is a very prominent person who is taken from South Africa in that way, but it's a history that stretches before Biko and after Biko, and indeed into the present in many ways.
Yes, indeed. I think we need to remember that the brutality of our system, in a way, is still there, because we haven't dealt with the injustices of the past. And the fact that Biko died in such a terrible and brutal way made big headlines and still remains very impactful. But he is one of many who sacrificed whose lives were taken from them through the brutal system that had gone on for decades already. I am reminded of the fact that there were people dying in detention right back in the 60s. And we have a record of them, and we've forgotten many of them. So fortunately, not fortunately, that's not the right word, but Biko reminds us of that, because he was well known and because his legacy is commemorated. But the brutality of life for people in prison, in detention, continues, I suspect, still to this day. And we need to reform all those services which should be for the good of society, to incarcerate people, yes, who should not be allowed to be free and doing harm to society, but to do so in a way which is humane and responsible, and the state must take responsibility for it. For example, the fact that many of our prisons are run by independent agencies, not with responsible people to the public in command of what happens within them. So the lessons from the past have not been learnt. And it's, as Dr. Cooper is saying, it's just too easy to for people to try and find good lives for themselves rather than addressing the issues of the whole society.
Absolutely. Another experience that looms large in South African history is, of course, the TRC. And of course, Biko's memory is linked with the TRC to the extent of the refusal of amnesty for his killers. How do you reflect, unfortunately we have just a few minutes until our break, but having worked so closely with the TRC on the way that the TRC impacts and influences the remembrance of Steve Biko today, and the lack of concrete accountability that came from the terrible killing of Steve Biko?
Yes, when one looks back at that time and remembers that the case that the Biko family brought to try and prevent the Truth Commission from being established in such a way that it granted amnesty to people and prevented families from bringing prosecutions, has turned out into a situation where amnesty was granted to many people, where they probably should not have been. And also that nowadays the battle for prosecutions continues as desperately as ever to bring the perpetrators to justice.
Indeed, absolutely. We'll come back, because both of our guests have touched on the condition of South African society today, and particularly the role of basic service delivery. And we're going to put that against the legacy of Steve Biko and ask whether South Africa in democratic moments has failed that important legacy and those important sacrifices. Stay with us. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're asking a provocative question tonight. Has democratic South Africa failed Steve Biko's legacy and his sacrifice for that very freedom? Professor Cooper, Mrs. Burton just had a very fascinating insight on the way that the TRC links with the legacy of Steve Biko. What's your view on that? Because in some ways we blame the TRC and say, well, no one was held accountable. In this case, actually, the TRC refused to grant amnesty.
Yes.
And yet the prosecution never really happened. And in 2003, I believe the government said, well, there just wasn't enough evidence to go forward with it. And so South Africa commemorates this heroic figure, but we're always left with this sense of unfinished business?
I think that some of the people in charge played a direct role in preventing the TRC recommendations from seeing fruition. You know, the TRC has volumes in its report and a few volumes on recommendations. There hasn't been the kind of reparation, I'm not talking financial, the kind of reparation that would see us being less angry, less blaming, and less also very accusatory against democracy. Because you see, you can't blame a constitution for failures of people. So the result is you're getting trashing of the constitution. You're also getting people who will bray for the blood of a killer instead of looking at that person should not ever see the light of day again, but we won't act like him. You know, because if you go to the level of the rapist and the murderer, what does it say for our society? Thank God, thank heaven, the Constitutional Court has outlawed capital punishment. Otherwise, we would probably be continuing to hang people like we did in Pretoria Central, you know, and the kinds of things that happen where people say, that man, usually it's a male, who does these horrendous acts, we should do this and we should do that to them. So we haven't dealt with the actions of the past, the failures of leadership, successive leadership to implement even the basic aspects of the recommendations of the TRC. And then we blame Desmond Tutu, we blame Mary Burton, we blame all these good-minded people for doing what they were asked to do.
And let me put that to you, Mrs. Burton, because again, this is such a fascinating case in point. The TRC actually denies amnesty, but the prosecution that needs to follow actually never really materializes. And we've seen this pattern with Biko, but that's almost representative of so many other cases in which, for some reason, the political will to actually pursue true accountability for apartheid crime has somehow got lost in the last 30 years of our democratic experiment.
Yes, thank you, Israel. Archbishop Tutu said there can be no future without forgiveness. I would like to add to that there can be no forgiveness and no reconciliation without justice. And what has happened is that it has become very, very difficult to bring about justice in the cases of so many people who were tortured and killed while in the custody of the state. And I'd like to pay tribute to the lawyers and the families who have persisted on and on and on to take up the question of amnesty and what it did to prevent people being brought to court. I think that there are two kinds of justice, really, that were expected to come out of the recommendations of the Truth Commission. And one of them is the question of reparations and what kind of reparations, which is not what we're talking about tonight. And the other is the prosecution of those who either failed to even approach the Amnesty Committee to receive amnesty, or who applied and were found to have committed such horrendous acts that they did not qualify for amnesty. Those prosecutions should have followed immediately after the ending of the Truth Commission. And that would have cleared a great deal of hurt and ill feeling from the body public, even though it could not reach everybody. But it should have proceeded fast. And here we are all these years later, and now, thanks to families and thanks to lawyers and thanks to the Foundation of Human Rights, those things are beginning to have some success. But they have very little impact on public knowledge because people are not aware of the history of those cases. And so it remains an area which does not seem to be a main priority for the NPA. And we need to keep up the pressure to pursue these cases while there are still people alive who can be brought to court.
Do you have any inkling as to why the government at that crucial period right after the TRC dragged its feet?
Look, there are many suspicions that there was a secret deal done between the African National Congress and the previous government. It has been very difficult to find any actual evidence of that, which is probably a prerequisite for secret deals. And one cannot tell if that was the case. But it certainly seems to have suited both the past government and the present government to turn at least an attitude of disinterest on the work that needs to be done to bring successful prosecutions to court, timelessly.
Professor Cooper, any thoughts from your side on that key moment and why we let it slip?
I think there were a few factors. Amongst them was fear. Fear of exposure from for those who were masquerading as our liberators, some of them, because, and lots of information is coming out now that many of them work for the other side. The fact that those who were granted amnesty, and you can look at those torturers, some of them were employed by leading political figures and are still employed, especially in the personal security and other security environment. There's a COSAS 4 case now where a person like Mama Sela is given a state contract on security. How does that happen? You know, you've got to ask. And that's why you get such anger from those who gave their youth to the struggle. You know, many of them went for training, went abroad, others remained, and they ended up in prison. This morning I had, was part of a discussion with some leadership of ex-political prisoners, and we're looking and trying to look at how is it that some people benefited and those who were murderers, terrible murderers, were freed. You know, it was not ironic that on the day that the Concord found that President Zuma needed to go back to prison, on that day they found that they needed to release the killer of, well, one of the known killers of Hani. So you've got all these contradictions happening, and you wonder what agenda is at play.
Some of the killers themselves actually benefited, let alone were set free, are living,
they absolutely
as
benefit.
we say, living their best lives right now.
Yes, the leader of Flakplas, for instance, was paid, given, you know, and nobody can locate where he is because the state is protecting him. So what information does a person like that have on the so-called Askaris that maybe Sats Cooper worked for them, that I was turned in Compol building when I was tortured between 74 and 75, that I went to Robben Island fakely, and you know, came out and benefited. So all those questions are there, and I'm speaking from a position of somebody who committed to opposing that system. And now many comrades from across the board, the liberation organizations, are asking those questions. And there's the sneaking feeling that the fear was, well, who accuses? Because we can accuse you in turn. And you did this, or were you not paid? We know you received money from us. So the government has not, whoever's been in leadership in the government has not allayed that suspicion. And it's about time that the justice authorities in this country came clean. After all, Vusi Pikole, who was one of our directors of public prosecutions, raised with his minister that you are interfering in my business, and was fired subsequently. So if that can happen at that level, an ordinary ex-political prisoner, an ordinary APLA, MK, Azanla Keda, will not want to come clean on saying, Cooper, you are a commissar, but we know you work for the other side.
On that note, let's go to a break. So much unresolved in our country's history that we continue to grapple with on this day, and the memory of Steve Biko evokes these conversations. We return to ask where to for the future. How should we ensure that we continue to commemorate Steve Biko in the appropriate way in the next 30 years? Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Unfiltered. Has democratic South Africa failed the legacy of Steve Biko? That's the question we're provocatively putting to you and our panel tonight. Mrs. Burton, of course, please feel free to respond to anything that has happened in the conversation. Of course, we were talking about some of the unresolved scars at the center of South African society. But one further question that I'd like to add to the pot, as it were, is it seems like the question of racial justice, which Steve Biko was so much at the forefront of, has in some ways fallen off the agenda of the South African public debate in recent years. I think in the fees must fall moment, it seemed that that question was surging to the forefront. And then bizarrely, it's in some ways receded from view. There's something quite sad to me about the way we're no longer even having the conversation about racial justice in a country where there seems to be so much racial justice in addition to other forms of injustice. Your thoughts on that?
Well, indeed, there does seem to be a great deal that we need to do. And your question about what we do over the next 30 years is really important. Immediately, I would think that we should complete the prosecutions and exposure tasks which need to be carried out. There are still families who are waiting for justice and for information about how their family members were killed. And that needs to be done so that we have the respect for what happened to those individuals in the past and how those were a symbol of our past society. Secondly, we need to pay really serious attention to the socio-economic issues that are ruining our country, that millions and millions of people go to bed unhoused, hungry, possibly ill and not being able to get adequate treatment, possibly refugees who are living in even worse circumstances. All of those things, our economy is skewed, badly skewed, so that people who are wealthy are not managing to cover through taxation and through other purposes the needs of the economy. We need to get that straight, and that means we also have to have honest people who are making the decisions about our socioeconomic issues. And thirdly, I think that we need to really consider very, very seriously how we elect people who will do these things into government. We have an election coming up next year. We hear many young people's voices saying, what's the good? It doesn't help to vote. It does help to vote. It helps to get honest people, representative people who will be accountable to the whole population into governing roles at national and at local government levels. It's absolutely crucial that we do that, because without a government that is really concerned, we're going to go on having people who are desperate for SASSA grants, which are inadequate, which are badly managed, and which are not a dignified way for the mass of our population to live.
Professor Cooper, your thoughts on Mrs. Burton's interventions in terms of what we need to do as a society to truly honor the legacy of the likes of Biko, who've sacrificed so much?
The likes of Biko and all the other, the pantheon I've mentioned, and if maybe 50% of the Freedom Charter were implemented, then we can be better off. I don't think that the leadership we have now is fit for purpose in terms of really meeting the demands of a different generation of young people who live in the third decade of the 21st century. They have actually very little understanding of that generation. And that generation comprises 60% of the population. Under 25, 60% of the population. And there's also 60% of the population that go to bed in the hunger, the other conditions that Mrs. Burton referred to, and nobody seems to care. And we laud the fact that we give them 350 Rand, which is carried over from COVID, and then we're giving them 1,000 or a couple of thousand, and yet not one of them thinks a jot when they enter a restaurant and pay for a meal that costs more than that amount. There isn't the compassion, there isn't the caring, there isn't the consideration and the commitment to uphold this democracy. And if leadership doesn't have it, you're going to get a plethora of political parties being formed, like we saw with the local government elections, and more being formed now. And it's just politics is the new economy, if you like, where wasteful, fruitless expenditure is incurred, where we're keeping people who don't need to be kept in those positions. We should be actually looking at why we're in the state, and good people have actually done serious work on the inherent deficiencies in our electoral system. Yet, Parliament that's conflicted passed the bill by a majority to retain the current system, making it so punitive for people to stand as individual candidates. You and I can form our own parties. Yes, it's easier. But to stand as an independent, it's more onerous. We need direct accountability. We don't need layer upon layer of people in the system controlling our so-called public representatives who represent their party bosses and not the people. But they're going to tell us in these next few months, until about May, when I think we're going to have an election, how they care for us and so on. Why do you think young people are not registered to vote? Who they ask, should I vote for? You know, you come of the generation of my children, and they've been asking, you know, you've been saying we should register. Yes, we register, but who do we vote for? So if young people are raising those questions, we've got a powder keg. And July 2021 happened. It's going to happen again if we don't take note that we've got a seething mass of young people who are out of the system.
Mrs. Burton, could I ask for your concluding thoughts as we round up the show? We have about a minute left until our break, but could you do the honor of rounding off our show tonight?
I agree with Dr. Cooper that it's a very good idea to try and get independent voices, because the question is, how do we get to the next stage? How do we reach a situation where Parliament does respond to the needs of the people? Even a few independent voices would make Parliament a slightly different place, where the issues are the point, and not who's getting on with who and what parties are joining together in order to retain power. So I would argue that no matter how dire the situation is, it's time to use one's vote.
Well, Mrs. Burton, thank you very much for joining us. Professor Cooper, thank you for your insights. This evening we have delved into the legacy of Steven Bantu Biko, what it means, but also what it will mean for South Africa's future. You've been commenting on social media. Let's take a look at some of your comments. Mpolisi says, dismally so, it's like we have voted white minority out to be oppressed by our own black majority. Black people remain most marginalized post-apartheid. PJ says, Lubelo, it has not only failed Biko's legacy, it disgraces it in as much as it insults us. And if we are to reconstruct his legacy, we need to go beyond and locate it within the harsh socio-economic challenges of our country. 29 has been adequate enough to address these. And finally, Ndalamo says, yes, it has failed dismally. The current ruling elite have no clue on what Steve Biko and other stalwarts have fought and died for. Democracy has less meaning, values and direction, and I wonder what Steve Biko is saying where he is. Let's continue this conversation on social media. Tonight, we've explored the legacy of Steve Biko in South Africa's past, its present, and its future. But the elusive journey towards a society with a more human face is a battle we continue to fight. Let's continue that fight, and thank you for joining us on Unfiltered this evening. Join us for the next installment of Unfiltered News, Unfiltered Views, and Unfiltered Conversations.